August 7, 1942, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The air hung thick with salt and cordite. In a hastily dug communications post near the edge of the jungle, a young Japanese signals intelligence officer pressed weathered headphones against his ears, his fingers poised over a notepad that would remain blank. Through the static and the distant thunder of American artillery, voices came through, human voices, undeniably human, yet speaking words that seemed to defy the very structure of language itself. Not English, not any European tongue, catalogued in the Imperial Army's extensive intelligence libraries. The sounds tumbled over one another like river stones, sharp consonants and flowing vowels that followed no pattern his training had prepared him for. He had broken British diplomatic codes in Singapore. He had intercepted American field communications in the Philippines. He had spent 3 years studying at the Imperial Naval Academy's cryptography school, where instructors had drilled into him the fundamental truth that every code, every cipher, every system of human communication could be reduced to mathematics, to patterns, to inevitable revelation. But this sound that came through his equipment, this felt like something else entirely, something that existed outside the realm of the possible. He did not know then that he was listening to something that would never be broken. That 6 months from that humid August morning, his superiors would quietly reassign their best code breakers away from this particular problem. Not because they had solved it, but because they had concluded, reluctantly, impossibly, that they could not. The Japanese Empire entered the Second World War with perhaps the most sophisticated signals intelligence apparatus in the Pacific theater. This was not arrogance or propaganda. This was documented capability, proven in blood and victory. In the years before Pearl Harbor, Japanese cryptographers had successfully penetrated American diplomatic codes, giving Tokyo advance knowledge of Washington's negotiating positions during the tense months before war erupted. They had broken Chinese military ciphers throughout the long, grinding conflict in Manchuria and coastal China. They had intercepted and decoded communications from British, Dutch, and Australian forces across Southeast Asia. The Imperial Japanese Navy's Communication Intelligence Unit, known as the Special Intelligence Section, employed over 3,000 personnel by 1942, many of them university-educated specialists in mathematics, linguistics, and the emerging science of radio interception. These were not amateur enthusiasts. These were professionals who understood that modern warfare had become, in essential ways, a war of information, that victory belonged to those who could see the enemy's intentions before the enemy could execute them. Their American counterparts knew this well, too well. In the months after Pearl Harbor, as Japanese forces swept across the Pacific with stunning speed, taking Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, Singapore, Burma, American commanders faced a terrifying reality. The enemy could hear them. Every radio transmission, every coded message, every operational order broadcast over military frequencies was subject to interception, analysis, and exploitation. The standard field codes used by American forces, the numerical substitution systems and transposition ciphers that had seemed adequate in peacetime exercises, were proving dangerously vulnerable in actual combat. Japanese intelligence had demonstrated repeatedly that they could break these codes within hours or days of implementation. At Bataan, American forces had been forced to change their encoding systems 3 times in 2 months because Japanese units consistently anticipated their movements. In the early naval engagements in the Coral Sea and off the Philippine coast, there were disturbing indications that enemy commanders knew American ship positions and intentions before those intentions could be translated into action. This was the strategic context that made the Navajo Code Talkers not merely useful, but essential. Not clever, not innovative in some peripheral way, absolutely essential to the survival of American forces, fighting across thousands of miles of hostile ocean, but to understand what the Japanese heard and why it defeated them, one must first understand what they expected to hear Japanese cryptographic doctrine in 1942 rested on several fundamental assumptions. Assumptions so deeply embedded in their training and methodology that they functioned almost as articles of faith. First, that all military codes were essentially mathematical systems, regardless of surface appearance. Substitution ciphers, transposition ciphers, book codes, mechanical encryption devices. All of these reduced ultimately to patterns of transformation that could be reversed through sufficient analysis. Second, that frequency analysis, the counting and cataloging of how often particular symbols or sounds appeared in intercepted messages, would eventually reveal the underlying structure of any code. Third, that all human languages, being products of human cognition, shared certain universal characteristics, grammar, syntax, semantic meaning, that could be exploited by skilled linguists working in conjunction with cryptographic specialists. These assumptions were not unreasonable. They had proven effective against virtually every code system the Japanese had encountered. British diplomatic traffic, American naval codes, Chinese military communications, all had fallen eventually to patient application of cryptographic principles. The Navajo language, Diné Bizard, as its speakers called it, violated every one of these assumptions. When the first Navajo Code Talkers went into combat in August 1942, attached to Marine Corps units landing on Guadalcanal, they began transmitting battlefield communications in a system so fundamentally alien to Japanese intelligence analysts that it might as well have been broadcast from another planet. The messages were not encrypted. They were not encoded in the conventional sense. They were spoken in a living language that existed almost entirely outside the awareness of the modern world, a language shaped by thousands of years of cultural isolation in the American Southwest, a language whose structure and vocabulary bore no meaningful resemblance to any tongue documented in Japanese intelligence files. Lieutenant Commander Tsuneo Nishimura, who headed the Imperial Navy's Signals Intelligence Section in the Solomon Islands during late 1942, would later write in documents recovered after the war that the first Navajo transmissions produced what he called cognitive dissonance among his analysts. They could hear that these were human voices. They could detect the rhythms of communication, the question and answer patterns that suggested tactical coordination. But they could not isolate individual words. They could not identify repeated phrases. They could not even determine whether the language was tonal, inflected, or based on some other principle of sound differentiation that their European language training had not prepared them to recognize. The Japanese did what they always did when confronted with an unknown code. They recorded everything. They built extensive libraries of intercepted Navajo transmissions, storing them on magnetic wire recorders and detailed phonetic transcriptions. They assembled teams of linguists, specialists in English, Chinese, Russian, Malay, and various indigenous Pacific languages. They brought in anthropologists who had studied Native American tribes before the war. They consulted with academics who had published on American indigenous languages in German and French journals. They applied frequency analysis, timing analysis, traffic analysis, every tool in the cryptographic arsenal. Nothing worked. The problem, they gradually realized, operated on multiple levels simultaneously, each layer of difficulty compounding the others into something approaching impossibility. First level, the Navajo language itself possessed grammatical structures that were utterly foreign to Japanese analysts. Navajo is a tonal language, but not in the way that Mandarin or Japanese are tonal. Its tones do not merely distinguish meaning between otherwise identical words. They integrate with a complex system of verbal aspects and modal distinctions that convey information about time, manner, and speaker attitude in ways that English or Japanese accomplish only through multiple auxiliary words. A single Navajo verb can encode information that would require an entire sentence in English, and that sentences' structure would vary dramatically depending on context, speaker intent, and the specificity of the action being described. Japanese cryptographers found that what sounded like the same word repeated in multiple transmissions would, upon closer analysis, prove to be several different words whose tonal similarities concealed entirely different meanings. Second level, Navajo phonology included sounds that Japanese speakers literally could not reproduce or, in some cases, distinctly hear. The language contains lateral fricatives, ejective consonants, and nasal vowels that do not exist in Japanese, English, or most European languages. When Japanese linguists attempted to transcribe Navajo speech phonetically, they found themselves unable to consistently represent the sounds they were hearing. What one analyst transcribed as ch, another might write as tl or tits, and none of these romanizations captured the actual acoustic properties of the Navajo sound. This meant that building a vocabulary list, the essential first step in breaking any linguistic code, became impossible. They could not reliably identify when a sound had been repeated because they could not reliably transcribe the sound in the first place. Third level, Navajo vocabulary offered no cognates, no loanwords, no familiar anchors that might allow Japanese analysts to gain initial entry into the language's meaning. When British or American forces used codes based on European languages, there were always patterns that cryptographers could exploit, grammatical structures inherited from Latin, vocabulary borrowed between languages, proper nouns that appeared in multiple contexts. Navajo had developed in complete isolation from European contact until the late 19th century. It had no inherited Greek roots, no Romance language cognates, no Germanic compound words that might be recognized by an analyst familiar with Western languages. Even counting systems, which often provide early breakthroughs in cryptographic work because they appear frequently and follow logical patterns, proved useless. Navajo numbers follow a vigesimal system, base 20 rather than base 10, and their formation involves complex combinations of roots and modifiers that obscured even this fundamental aspect of quantification. Fourth level, and perhaps most devastating, the code talkers were not simply speaking Navajo. They were speaking in an additional layer of code built on top of the Navajo language. This is the dimension that Japanese intelligence failed to grasp for months, and by the time they understood it, the war had moved beyond their ability to respond effectively. The Navajo Code Talkers had developed a specialized military vocabulary that replaced tactical terms with Navajo words for natural objects, animals, and familiar concepts from their traditional culture. An aircraft carrier was not described by any Navajo word, meaning large ship that carries aircraft. It was called tobahi, which meant whale. Fighter planes were dahitihi, meaning hummingbird. Bombs were ayashi, meaning eggs. A submarine was beige wu, literally iron. Vish. This was not simple metaphor. This was a systematically constructed vocabulary that allowed Navajo speakers to discuss modern military equipment using words that, even if Japanese cryptographers had understood Navajo, would have sounded like discussions of nature and wildlife. A transmission that said literally, "The whale is followed by 3 hummingbirds and will drop many eggs on the iron fish near the big water," was actually communicating. "The aircraft carrier is escorted by 3 fighters and will bomb the submarine near the coast." But the vocabulary transformation went deeper still. The Code Talkers had created a Navajo alphabet system for spelling out words that had no Navajo equivalent, proper names, map coordinates, technical terms. Each letter of the English alphabet was represented by a Navajo word, and crucially, multiple Navajo words could represent the same letter to prevent frequency analysis. The letter A could be wullachi, ant, belasana, dapple, or tanil, axe. The letter E could be dze, elk, aja, ear, or ana, eye. This meant that even if Japanese cryptographers had somehow acquired a working knowledge of Navajo, Even if they had broken through the impossible barriers of grammar and phonology and vocabulary, they would still have faced an additional encoding layer that appeared to Navajo fluent ears to be random nature words spliced into otherwise comprehensible sentences. In September 1942, 5 weeks after the Navajo Code first appeared in Japanese intercepts, Lieutenant Commander Nishimura's unit received a priority directive from Tokyo, assign maximum resources to breaking the American Indigenous language code. This was not optional. This was recognition at the highest levels of Japanese military intelligence that the Americans had deployed something genuinely new, something that was costing them battles. At Guadalcanal, American forces were coordinating complex amphibious operations, calling in artillery strikes and directing air support with a speed and security that made them nearly impossible to counter. Japanese commanders reported that American tactical communications appeared to be transmitted without any time delay for encoding or decoding, suggesting either that the encryption system was mechanical and very fast, or more disturbing, that it was not encryption at all, but some form of communication that did not require cryptographic processing. The Japanese pulled their best people, cryptographers who had broken British codes in Singapore, linguists who spoke 8, 10, 12 languages. They even located, this detail appears in recovered post-war documents, a Japanese soldier who had attended primary school in Arizona in the 1920s and had encountered Navajo children in trading posts near the reservation. This soldier, whose name appears in records as Sergeant Yoshida, was transferred to signals intelligence and tasked specifically with analyzing Navajo transmissions. He confirmed what the analysts feared. Yes, this was an American indigenous language. No, he could not understand it. His childhood exposure had been limited to perhaps a dozen words, greetings, simple trading terms. The language he was hearing in the intercepts was as incomprehensible to him as it was to the other analysts. The Japanese tried computational approaches. Insofar as computation existed in 1942, they built enormous frequency tables, plotting every sound they could distinguish against every other sound, looking for patterns of repetition, for sequences that might indicate common words or phrases. They analyzed transmission timing, trying to correlate the length of messages with the outcomes of subsequent battlefield actions, hoping to at least categorize messages by type, reconnaissance reports versus attack orders versus supply requests, even if they could not read the content. They attempted what modern cryptographers would call traffic analysis, mapping who transmitted to whom, when, and how often, trying to understand American command structure and communication patterns even without breaking the code itself. By November 1942, 3 months into intensive effort, Japanese intelligence had managed to establish only the most basic facts about the Navajo transmissions. The same approximate voice patterns appeared across multiple communication networks, suggesting that perhaps 50 to 100 individual speakers were being used. 2. Transmissions occurred primarily during American offensive operations, with particularly heavy usage immediately before and during coordinated attacks. 3. The language was almost certainly indigenous North American, possibly from the southwestern United States, based on comparative phonetic analysis with limited academic materials available in Japanese university libraries. 4. Breaking it through conventional cryptographic means appeared to be impossible. That final conclusion did not appear in any official report. It could not. The Imperial Japanese military did not produce reports stating that a problem was impossible. But the operational reality became clear through resource allocation. By December 1942, the number of personnel assigned specifically to Navajo code analysis had been quietly reduced. Not eliminated, that would suggest defeat, but reduced, with the best cryptographers reassigned to other priorities, other problems where success seemed achievable. The pretense was maintained. Navajo intercepts continued to be recorded and filed. Analysts continued to generate reports describing what they had heard and what they had attempted. But the urgent, desperate effort that had characterized the first 3 months gradually subsided into resigned routine. By February 1943, 6 months after the first Navajo transmissions had baffled Japanese listeners, the Imperial Army's signals intelligence assessment contained a single paragraph about what they now called the American Indigenous language system. The paragraph stated that the system appeared to be used primarily by United States Marine Corps units, that it showed no signs of cryptographic weakness, and that interception resources were better allocated to other American military communications that showed greater potential for exploitation. This was as close as the Japanese military would come to admitting complete failure, but what did they actually hear? What was the subjective experience of those Japanese signals officers sitting in humid jungle outposts or cramped radio rooms on transport ships, listening hour after hour to sounds that refused to resolve into meaning? Several Japanese veterans of signals intelligence, interviewed decades after the war, described the experience in remarkably similar terms. The Navajo transmissions produced a specific kind of cognitive frustration, different from the challenge of breaking a difficult code. With a conventional cipher, even a strong one, there was a sense of confronting a puzzle, difficult, perhaps temporarily insurmountable, but comprehensible as a problem. The encrypted message was still English or Japanese underneath, and the cryptographer knew that the underlying structure made sense, that it only needed to be revealed. With Navajo, there was no such assurance. The sounds seemed to slide away from comprehension. The mind could not find purchase. One veteran described it as trying to grab water with your bare hands, the sensation that something was there. Definitely there, but that it escaped capture through the very act of reaching for it. This was not merely a technical failure, it was a philosophical crisis, though that would not become apparent to Japanese intelligence until the cumulative weight of multiple failures, cryptographic, tactical, strategic, forced a broader reckoning with their assumptions about American capabilities. The Japanese had entered the war with a particular conception of their enemy. American forces were viewed as technologically advanced but culturally soft, lacking the spiritual discipline and self-sacrifice that characterized Japanese military culture. American wealth and industrial capacity were acknowledged, even feared, but this material advantage was understood to be offset by weaknesses in morale, cohesion, and fighting spirit. The expectation was that Japanese superior will and superior warrior ethos would eventually overcome American superior materiel. This was not crude propaganda. This was serious strategic analysis, grounded in observation of American behavior during the interwar years, in the political divisions and isolationist sentiment that had characterized American public discourse, in the racial and ethnic fragmentation that Japanese analysts believed would undermine American unity under the pressures of total war. The Navajo Code Talkers represented something that did not fit this analysis. Here were Americans, Indigenous Americans, members of a group that Japanese intelligence knew had been subjected to conquest, displacement, and marginalization by the dominant white American culture, fighting with extraordinary effectiveness for the same nation that had oppressed them. And they were doing so using cultural resources, their language, their linguistic heritage, that white America itself could not access, could not replicate, could not even fully understand. The Code Talkers were not succeeding despite being Native American. They were succeeding specifically because they were Navajo, because they possessed cultural knowledge that existed outside and independent of the mainstream American culture that Japanese analysts had studied and believed they comprehended. This realization, partial and gradual as it was, suggested something troubling about the nature of American society. Perhaps it was not as fragmented as Japanese intelligence had assumed. Perhaps it had mechanisms for incorporating and utilizing diversity that the Japanese analysis had failed to recognize. Perhaps the very pluralism that looked like weakness, all those different ethnicities, languages, religions, regional cultures, was actually a source of strategic flexibility, a reservoir of unexpected capabilities that could be mobilized in ways that a more homogeneous society could not replicate. There is a small notation, buried deep in Japanese naval intelligence files recovered after the war. In a report dated March 1943, the report is primarily about radio frequency allocation and technical intercept capabilities in the Central Pacific. But in a marginal note, an intelligence officer has written, in Japanese, but translatable roughly as, "The American Indian language problem represents not technical failure, but conceptual failure. We have tried to break what cannot be broken because it was never constructed. Consider implications for broader understanding of enemy society." The notation is unsigned. It appears to have been ignored, but it represents a flicker of insight into what the Navajo Code actually meant, beyond its immediate tactical utility. For the Navajo Code Talkers themselves, the experience of being utterly unbreakable carried its own complex meaning. Many of them had been educated in government boarding schools specifically designed to eradicate their language, to force assimilation into mainstream American culture. They had been punished for speaking Navajo, had been taught that their language was primitive, dying, irrelevant to the modern world. And now, suddenly, that same language was the most valuable cryptographic asset in the United States Marine Corps. The language that was supposed to disappear was the only thing standing between American forces and Japanese intelligence. Penetration, Private First Class Chester Nez, one of the original 29 Navajo Code Talkers, would write decades later, "For us, the irony was very deep. The same government that had tried to take our language away now needed it to win the war. And we gave it, not because we had forgotten what had been done to us, but because we understood what freedom meant, even when that freedom had not always been extended to us." This was the dimension that Japanese intelligence could never hear through their headphones, could never deduce from their frequency analysis and phonetic transcriptions. They were listening to the sound of a people who had every reason to refuse, to withhold, to remain neutral in a conflict between the nation that had conquered them and a foreign empire they had no connection to. But the Navajo had chosen differently, not out of naive patriotism, not because they had forgotten the long walk, the forced relocations, the boarding schools, the systematic attempts to destroy their culture. They had chosen to fight because they understood, perhaps more clearly than most Americans, what totalitarianism looked like, what it meant to have your language suppressed and your identity denied. And they recognized those same impulses in the empire they were fighting against. The code was unbreakable for technical reasons, yes. The linguistic isolation, the grammatical complexity, the phonetic barriers, the layered vocabulary substitutions. But it was also unbreakable for human reasons that transcended cryptography. It was unbreakable because it was spoken by men who carried their entire history in their mouths when they transmitted coordinates and artillery vectors, who understood that every word they spoke in combat was an assertion of survival, a refusal of erasure, a demonstration that their culture was not primitive or dying but essential and alive and more powerful than any enemy's attempt to comprehend it. By the summer of 1943, Navajo Code Talkers were operating across the Pacific Theater, Bougainville, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. They transmitted tens of thousands of messages, coordinating operations involving hundreds of thousands of American troops. Japanese intelligence continued to intercept these transmissions. They filled warehouses with recordings, transcriptions, analytical reports, and they broke nothing, not a single message, not one word. In the years after the war, several Japanese cryptographers who had worked on the Navajo problem were interviewed by American military historians. One of them, whose name appears in declassified records only as Subject 14, provided perhaps the most revealing testimony. He described spending 8 months listening to Navajo transmissions, trying to hear patterns, trying to understand. He described the growing realization that he was confronting something outside his experience, outside his training, outside the conceptual framework he had been given for understanding human communication. And he described the moment when he finally understood what he was hearing. Not the words, never the words, but the fact of it. He said, "I realized I was listening to something very old that was being used for something very new, a language that existed before empires, being used to fight an empire. I could not break it because it was never meant to be broken. It was meant to be spoken, person to person, mouth to ear, passed down through generations, not as a code, but as a way of being. You cannot break a way of being. You can only recognize it, or fail to recognize it. We failed. The strategic consequences rippled outward in ways that were not always obvious in the moment, but became clear in retrospect. American forces gained the ability to conduct complex operations with a security that Japanese forces could not match. Amphibious landings, the most communication-intensive operations in warfare, could be coordinated in real time without fear of compromise. Artillery fire could be adjusted instantly based on forward observer reports. Air support could be called in with precision, with no delay for encoding or decoding, no opportunity for the enemy to intercept and understand and respond. The speed of American decision-making, enabled by secure and instantaneous communication, became a material advantage that compounded every other advantage, industrial, numerical, technological, but the deeper consequence was psychological. The Japanese military had entered the war confident in their ability to understand their enemy, to predict and counter American strategies, to exploit American weaknesses. The Navajo Code represented a category of American capability that they had not anticipated and could not counter. It suggested depths of resilience and adaptability in American society that their pre-war intelligence had not recognized. If America could mobilize an indigenous language spoken by perhaps 50,000 people, if it could turn that language into an unbreakable military asset, if it could inspire the loyalty of a people who had been conquered and marginalized, what else might America be capable of? What other unexpected strengths lay hidden, waiting to be mobilized? These questions did not appear in Japanese military planning documents. They appeared instead in the slow erosion of confidence, the gradual recognition that the enemy they were fighting was not the enemy they had expected, that American material superiority was amplified by social and cultural dynamics that Japanese analysis had misunderstood or ignored. There is a photograph taken in August 1945 on Okinawa, just days after the Japanese surrender. It shows a group of Navajo Code Talkers standing beside their radio equipment, their faces young and serious and exhausted. The photograph has been reproduced in countless history books, but what those books rarely mention is what happened just before the picture was taken. A Japanese signals intelligence officer, now a prisoner of war, was brought past the Code Talkers' position as part of a group being processed for internment. One of the Navajo Marines, recognizing the shoulder insignia of the signals unit, asked a translator to convey a question to the Japanese officer. "Did you ever figure out what we were saying?" The translator, a Nisei soldier who had spent the war proving his own loyalty while his family was held in internment camps in California, asked the question in Japanese. The officer stood silent for a long moment. Then he replied, and the translator conveyed his words back to the Navajo Code Talkers. "We heard everything. We understood nothing. It was like listening to ghosts." The translator, according to the account recorded in the unit diary, did not need to translate the Code Talkers' response. They simply nodded, They understood what the Japanese officer meant: ghosts, voices from a history that the modern world believed it had left behind, returning to shape the outcome of the most technologically advanced conflict in human history. Ghosts of cultures that were supposed to have vanished, proving instead that they were vital and present and capable of decisive action. Ghosts that could not be exercised by frequency analysis or linguistic expertise or mathematical brilliance, because they were not ghosts at all. They were living people, speaking a living language, carrying forward a heritage that had survived everything that had been done to destroy it. And they had won. Not won in the sense of single-handedly determining the war's outcome. No code system, however brilliant, could make that claim. But won in the sense that they had been given an impossible task: create an unbreakable code using nothing but your voices and your language. And they had achieved it so completely that the enemy, despite desperate effort, despite unlimited resources, despite cryptographic expertise honed over years of successful code breaking, had never come close to understanding what they were hearing. The Japanese quit after 6 months, not because they had exhausted all avenues of analysis, but because they had reached the limit of what their conceptual framework could accommodate. They quit because the Navajo Code exposed a limitation not just in their cryptographic methods, but in their understanding of what language was, what culture was, what America was. In the decades after the war, as the story of the Navajo Code Talkers gradually became public, they were sworn to secrecy for years as the military considered using the code in future conflicts. A common question emerged. Why didn't the Japanese just capture a Navajo speaker and force him to translate? The question reveals a misunderstanding of how the code worked. A captured Navajo speaker, under torture or coercion, could potentially translate individual words. He might confirm that "tobahi" meant whale, but he could not explain that whale meant aircraft carrier in the Code Talkers' vocabulary, because that was not Navajo. That was Marine Corps code built on top of Navajo, and it existed only in the training and memory of the Code Talkers themselves. Even with a Navajo translator, Japanese intelligence would still have been listening to what sounded like nature, poetry, discussions of hummingbirds, an iron fish and eggs falling from the sky, and they would have had no way to connect those poetic images to the mechanical realities of modern warfare without the specific key that the Code Talkers carried in their heads. But the deeper answer is simpler. The Japanese never captured a Navajo Code Talker, not in 4 years of brutal Pacific combat, not in desperate last-stand battles on islands where capture rates were high and survival rates were low. The Code Talkers were too valuable, and their fellow Marines understood what their loss would mean. There are accounts passed down through oral history, though never officially documented, of Marines assigned specifically to protect Code Talkers in combat, with orders to prevent their capture at any cost. The phrase, "at any cost," carried a dark implication that was understood by everyone involved, Code Talkers included. If capture was imminent, the code could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. This was not official policy. This could never be official policy. But in the chaos and extremity of Pacific Island warfare, understandings existed that went beyond official policy. The Navajo Code Talkers knew this. They carried it with them every time they transmitted coordinates for an artillery strike, every time they called in an air raid, every time they reported enemy positions while under fire. They knew they were irreplaceable. They knew the code lived in them, not in any book or machine. They knew that their value made them both essential and terribly vulnerable, that the same skill that kept them in the most dangerous positions also meant that their survival was a strategic necessity. And they transmitted anyway, clearly, quickly, without hesitation. Under artillery fire, during amphibious assaults, in the confusion of night battles, they spoke their language into radio handsets and coordinated the violence of modern war with a precision that saved countless American lives. This is what Japanese cryptographers were actually hearing, though they had no way to know it. The sound of men who had chosen, consciously and with full knowledge of the risks, to pour their language and their culture and their history into the machinery of industrial warfare, to make themselves into weapons that could not be countered or defeated or even understood by any enemy they faced. The recordings still exist, some of them, scratchy wire recordings from 1942 and 1943, stored in Japanese military archives, rediscovered decades later. The voices are young, speaking rapidly, with the flat emotional tone that good radio discipline requires. The words mean nothing to listeners who do not know the code, but the underlying sound, the rhythm, the tonal patterns, the phonetic textures, carry across the decades. Listen to them now, knowing what they accomplished, and you hear something that the Japanese analysts could never have detected: confidence, absolute certainty, the sound of men speaking their mother tongue in a context where that language had become the most powerful weapon in their arsenal. The Japanese quit not because they ran out of time or resources. They quit because they encountered something their entire analytical framework could not process: a culture that refused to die, speaking a language that refused to become extinct in the service of a nation that was finally beginning to recognize, however imperfectly, however slowly, that its strength lay not in homogeneity, but in the astonishing diversity of voices it could marshal when the stakes demanded it. There is symbolism here, though not in any single object. The symbolism is the code itself. The Navajo language, turned into an instrument of war, represented everything that totalitarianism sought to destroy: cultural particularity, linguistic diversity, the stubborn persistence of identities that refused to be assimilated or erased. The Japanese Empire, like all empires, sought uniformity. One language, one culture, one understanding of reality imposed from above. And it was defeated, at least in this dimension of the conflict, by the exact opposite, by a language so particular, so rooted in one specific history and geography and way of understanding the world, that it could not be learned or stolen or broken by anyone outside that tradition. The Americans did not win World War II because of the Navajo Code Talkers. That would be historical overstatement. But the Code Talkers embodied something essential about why America could mobilize and sustain the coalition that defeated fascism: the ability to recognize value in difference, to weaponize diversity, to understand that a society's strength comes not from forcing everyone to speak the same language, but from finding ways to let many languages speak together toward common purpose. This understanding was imperfect in 1942. It remains imperfect now. The Navajo people returned from the war to reservations that still lacked basic infrastructure, to schools that still discouraged their language, to a society that still marginalized their culture. The Code Talkers received no recognition for decades, their contribution classified, their sacrifice unacknowledged. When honors finally came, they came late, too late for many of the original Code Talkers to receive them. But the code itself remains, unbroken, unbreakable, a testament to the power of cultures that refuse erasure, languages that refuse extinction, people who understand that sometimes the old ways are not primitive relics to be discarded, but essential tools for confronting the modern world's most lethal challenges. The Japanese cryptographers who quit after 6 months were not failures. They were highly skilled professionals who encountered a problem that their training and tools and conceptual framework could not solve. They tried everything that should have worked. They brought all of their expertise to bear on a challenge that seemed initially like it must have a solution, and they learned, slowly and incompletely, that some things cannot be broken because they were never constructed. Some codes are not codes at all, but living languages, embedded in living cultures. carried forward by living people who understand that every word they speak is an assertion of existence, a refusal of oblivion, a declaration that they are here. They have always been here, and they will remain here long after the empires that tried to silence them have turned to dust. That is what the Japanese heard in those transmissions. Not words, they never understood the words, but something else. The sound of an enemy they could not defeat, speaking a language they could not break, representing a form of American power they had not anticipated and could not counter. They heard the voice of a people who had survived everything history could do to them, and who had turned that survival into a weapon more powerful than any cipher machine, more secure than any codebook, more enduring than any empire. They heard the future, though they did not recognize it as such. They heard a world in which diversity would be strength, in which cultural persistence would matter more than cultural dominance, in which an indigenous language spoken by tens of thousands would prove more valuable than the combined linguistic expertise of an empire of tens of millions. They heard themselves losing, though they could not have known that from the static and the strange consonants and the tones that shifted in ways their ears could not quite capture. They heard the sound of their own assumptions breaking apart, though they would not recognize that breaking for months or years, not until the cumulative weight of defeat made them reconsider everything they thought they understood about their enemy and themselves. They heard ghosts, as that officer said in August 1945, but they were wrong about what kind of ghosts. Not the ghosts of the dead, not the remnants of a vanished past. They were hearing the ghosts of their own inevitable defeat, carried on the voices of men whose language and culture and people were supposed to have disappeared into history, but who instead stepped forward into the present, into the crisis, into the fire, and spoke the words that would help destroy an empire. That is what the Japanese heard. That is why they quit. That is why the code was never broken, and why it remains, decades after the war's end, a reminder that the world's oldest voices can sometimes speak the newest truths, and that the languages we think are dying may be the very ones that save us when the stakes are highest and the need is greatest. The last message sent by a Navajo Code Talker in World War II was transmitted on August 14, 1945, minutes before the Japanese surrender was officially announced. The message was brief, a confirmation of ceasefire orders transmitted from Okinawa to Marine units scattered across the island. The code talker who sent it, whose name appears in records only as CPL Draper, ended his transmission with a phrase in Navajo that was not part of any official code, that violated radio protocol, that should probably have been edited out of the unit log. But it was preserved, and it translates roughly, "We have spoken, and they have heard, and it is finished." Not quite accurate as prophecy, the code talker's story was not finished, would not be finished for decades until their work was declassified and recognized and honored as it deserved. But accurate enough as description. They had spoken, in their language, with their voices, carrying their history into a war that tried to destroy history. And they had been heard, even if what was heard was incomprehensible, even if the hearing brought no understanding, even if the enemy only ever recognized that they were confronting something they could not break. That was enough. That was victory. Not in the grand strategic sense, but in the particular, human sense of people who were told their language had no value and proved, through blood and sacrifice and unbreakable transmissions across hostile waters, that their language had value beyond measure. The Japanese quit because they were listening for a code and hearing a culture. They quit because they were trying to break an encryption system and encountering a civilization. They quit because every tool they possessed, every skill they had developed, every assumption they brought to the problem was designed for one kind of challenge. And the Navajo Code was something else entirely, something older and stranger and more resilient than any code system designed in a laboratory or taught in a classroom. They quit because they were defeated, not by technology, not by cryptographic cleverness, but by the stubborn persistence of a people and a language that refused to become what the modern world expected them to become: relics, curiosities, footnotes to history. Instead, the Navajo Code Talkers became history itself, the living voice of a truth that empires continually forget, that the cultures you try to erase are often the ones you will need most desperately, that the languages you dismiss as primitive may contain the keys to problems your own language cannot solve, and that victory in the end belongs not to those who impose unity, but to those who can recognize, respect, and mobilize the irreducible diversity of human experience. That is what echoes now. Across the decades, when we listen to those old recordings of Navajo transmissions, not the words, most of us will never understand the words, but the fact of them, the sound of an unbroken code in an unbroken language spoken by an unbroken people, changing the world one transmission at a time, proving that sometimes the oldest voices speak the truths we most need to hear, if only we have the wisdom to listen.